The Branson School Alumni Council is honored to present the 2019 Distinguished Alumni Award to Rabbi Dr. Rabbi Artson.
Thanks, everybody. I can't tell you how moving it is to be here. And I want to start off by thanking people who were in the school back when the world was in black and white. Thank you to my classmates and dear lifelong friends. If you play it right here, you'll make friends who will be your closest friends for the rest of your life. So it's a special place. And to you guys who are teachers and students now, I want to start by saying that the school is really extraordinary. It was great when we went there. It's way better now. Looking at the diversity of what's taught and who's teaching, the diversity of who's learning and whose voices are being heard, you look to me like a dream come true. So keep doing what you're doing, because it's going to change the world eventually. Thank you. So I know you've been focusing a lot on character, and I want to do that too, but I need to take a running jump. I want to start by thinking about one of the greatest scientists up until today, a man named Alexander Humboldt. And he was a German who lived in the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. He traveled the world. He was one of the first people to come up with the notion of the world not as separate, independent entities, but as a single organism. Right? So the whole notion of ecology and of environmental sciences, in a sense, he was the great-great-granddaddy of that insight. But what I'd like to focus on is something that pertains to what we have to struggle with and also to transform. While he was on the Amazon, he noticed two things that changed his view. Up until then, the view was either that nature was a wilderness waiting to be domesticated, and so you look at European gardens up until that time, and they're extraordinarily ordered and disciplined and, frankly, from our perspective, dull. Or the idea was that nature was this harmonious paradise, the Garden of Eden that we've been kicked out of because of civilization, and so we needed to find a way to get back to perfection. So there he is in the Amazon, and he's very much one of those Garden of Eden guys, and he notices there are these wild pigs called tapirs. The pigs would be in the water, and the crocodiles and alligators would start to swim over to them. That, by the way, is not a good thing. If you're ever in the water and an alligator swims over to you, you might want to consider leaving the water quickly. Piece of life advice from a rabbi. So they would run out of the water to get away from the reptiles, and on the shore were jaguars waiting to take them down. Oh. Flying fish would try to escape the teeth of dolphins by leaving the water to jettison into the air, and they would get attacked by birds of prey. And he realized that the natural world advances on terror and bloodshed and domination and momentary advantage. And that in fact the evolutionary process requires that level of vicious and violent competition. The complexity of life that you see all around you comes in part because of the harmonious cooperation among and between species, but it also comes because of the fragility of life and the viciousness by which it's terminated. That's our heritage. We are hairless apes. And we have in our nature that millions of years old drive to succeed and to conquer, even if it's at the expense of others. But here's one of the unexpected things that happened along the way towards evolution. As we're evolving into better and more ruthless killers, as life has diversified into filling in every possible niche and taking advantage of every possible opportunities, the predators are running faster, so the prey are running faster, right? Life is spilling over in an attempt to either eat or avoid being eaten. There evolved a level of consciousness as an adaptation that spontaneously generated care. Mammals are those creatures that have made it evolutionarily beneficial to take care of their young. We fall in love with each other. And that overflowing of love doesn't replace the brutal competition out of which it emerged, but it became a potent force to move evolution in a different way. And the choice that we have as individuals and as a culture is, do we want to remake ourselves in the light of this later add-on? Love, compassion, justice. So I come from the Jewish tradition, although I just want to say I come from it in a weird way. I grew up absolutely not religious. Nobody in this room is more surprised that I'm a rabbi than the people who were in my class. They can tell you all the non-rabbinic things I did in high school. And no. Everyone but him, don't talk to Mark. But I came to this tradition as an adult, although I was born Jewish, and I want to share with you something that is compelling, not because it's unique to being Jewish, but because every wisdom tradition has this choice built in. Turns out if you look at the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, which for the Jews are the holiest part of the Bible, there are 2 great stories. The first great story is that out of the raw material of chaos, in Hebrew tohu vavohu, the oneness that undergirds it all, which our tradition calls God, lured that chaos towards cosmos. And that was understood as an act of love. That God loved the world, but you can't love if you're alone. So the one thing God couldn't do was enter into a love relationship without creating something that could be loved and could love. So our story starts with unearned love. We're alive, and none of us did anything to deserve that. We're born into a world that's prepared for us, well and ill, but prepared for us. And the second great story of the Hebrew Bible is that a group of abominated outcasts, people who the dominant culture wouldn't let sit at the table, people who the dominant culture enslaved and oppressed and butchered and beat, that those people at some point determined that they had to be free. And before their slaveholders liberated them, they started crying out. And that act of crying out is the first step of liberation. The first step is to say, this doesn't have to be this way. I'm not prepared to tolerate this anymore. And in the crying out, that's what made freedom possible. And the second great teaching then of the Bible, of the Torah, is that the universe leans towards freedom. That human history is the slow and imperfect story of pharaohs being brought down. Those are the 2 stories. Everything else in the Torah is a detail. All of the rules are ways of remembering and living those values. All of the other stories are just riffs on those stories. and you're studying a lot of literature, most of the literature you're going to read is derivative of those two stories, one or the other. You are lovable, and you are loved. And therefore, because of that, you must fight for freedom, your own and others. That's the bottom line. And the one who creates us and calls us into being, some of us believe that it's someone we can talk to. Some of us believe it's happenstance and a universe that is self-creating. I don't care. Neither does God. But that power that moves us into greater awareness of the transformative power of love, and that love in public is justice, that force is speaking powerfully in our time, and it will speak through you. It is the young people. It is you who have the opportunity to clean up the mess that we made and that we inherited. So what does that mean? It means you need to attend not just to the primate heritage that you have. Human beings are, to our knowledge, unique in that culture becomes an evolutionary force for us. You are in a program right now in which a good deal of what you're doing is absorbing the experiences and insights of people you've never met in person. When you're in a literature class, or a language class, or a history class, sorry science teachers, when you're in a science class, you are making your brain think the thoughts of people you never knew. That's distinctive to our species. So that you become bigger than your biological entity. Or let me say it better. Your biological entity expands to include a whole cultural influence. So the first thing I want to urge you to do is be relentlessly curious. Everything is interesting. Everything is worth asking questions about, not as much as Hans asks, but very interesting. Right? And so approach the world with wonder and curiosity. At the same time, I want to encourage you, don't sell yourself cheap. There's nothing wrong with being rich, but you can't cuddle with money. And at the end of your life, here's the question I want you to think about. Are you living your eulogy, or are you living your resume? A resume is, I had this job, I earned this income, I had these benefits, then I got this job, and I got these benefits, and this income. Here's the interesting thing I've learned as a rabbi. At a funeral, nobody cares. Nobody cares. The deceased doesn't care anymore. The family doesn't want to hear a listing of employment opportunities and gross worth. They tell stories about how this person went out of their way to take care of somebody. They talk about how this person was a loving parent, or a loving child, or a great neighbor, or did volunteer work, or had a vision and created something that nobody had thought of before. That's living your eulogy. And you now have a choice. It's age appropriate for you to focus on what you want to do in the world and how you want to make your mark. And here my only advice as a guy who teaches college and graduate students is let other people say no for you. Don't say no on their behalf. If you have a dream, follow that dream. Dream really big. There are a whole lot of people out there whose job it'll be to stop you. Don't be one of those people. You go for it. You can do it. But the other thing I want you to remember is that if your dream just involves ego, in the end, you will be successful and miserable and alone. And you deserve better than that. Because you are the child of hundreds of millions of years of life cascading into consciousness and self-consciousness, of the fountain blossoming into the capacity to love. And the ability to love is the ability to lift others with you and to change the world for the better. You are so privileged. You are so privileged to be in this place at this time, to be you. We live on the cusp of an age in which men can no longer harass women and get away with it. We're not there, but we're calling them out. We live on an age in which we understand the perilous cost of racism, not only to people of color, primarily to people of color, but the way it decimates white lives as well, making people callous and harsh and brutal. We look at patriarchy and how it has not only assaulted girls and women throughout the ages, including today, but it has made men incapable of feeling, incapable of loving their children, incapable of being human. And you have the opportunity to move the bar that much forward. And the way it starts is in here. Take advantage of everything this place can teach you, in the classroom and out of the classroom. Take advantage of the remarkable people who are in your class and in the classes around you. They will be your life teachers, and they will walk with you through life. Open yourself up to the Spirit however you understand it. Don't let yourself become a widget. You live in a grand universe that was created for you. It's all been set. The table and the feast are ready. You just have to sit at the table and decide what you want to eat and what you want to serve. So you'll forgive me, I'm a rabbi. I like to bless people. So I want to bless you. I want to bless you that you live your life in such a way that when you think about the things you used to do in high school that you can't do anymore, it makes you smile. And I want you to make time to do those things. And I want you to spend these years also arming yourself for the battle ahead. The battle is not for survival. All of you will have enough to eat. All of you will have a roof over your head. The battle is, what kind of world do you want it to be? When one of you is standing here and talking to some young people who are saying, boy, he really didn't take good care of himself, did he? I want you to be able to look at what your generation did and say, we made a difference. We moved the bar. The world's a better place now than it was when we were in high school, in part because of what we did together. You can do that. So my blessing for you is that you know your power, you aim high, and you make a difference on all of our behalf. Thank you so much for letting me do
Does anyone have a question?
I would like Martin and Brad to teach these people the intricacies of stupid.
Let me reframe the question. Does anybody currently in the school or in the faculty have a question?
Thank you for sharing with us today. Just curious, along your journey, you say you're much different from your faith and your religious beliefs from high school to now. Can you just briefly tell us what was maybe a defining moment or something along the journey that kind of brought you to what you're doing now? Sure.
So I grew up an atheist, and I will just tell you that being an atheist in the Bay Area is awesome. There's a lot of things to do. But I've always been someone who had a spiritual side. I just didn't have a place to hold it. And when I was in college, I was really bothered by the idea that there was no such thing as right or wrong. that all morality boiled down to was cultural preferences. And I never believed that. That's the weird thing about Jewish atheists, is that we have a morality that's absolute even though we don't have a philosophical place to put it. So I went to go talk to the rabbi on campus, and I said I want to try being a believer. And part of it was I had a roommate who was a Christian fundamentalist. And Peter was one of the kindest people I know. I think the best Christian since the first. And I had always been worried that being religious meant being stupid. And frankly, there's a good deal of evidence to support that. But Peter was really smart. He has gone on to become an MD, PhD, and he teaches computer science and surgery at Johns Hopkins. So he's not stupid. So I went to talk to the rabbi, and he said, you can't think about God from a neutral place. You have to give it a shot and see if it works for you. So he gave me a book to read by a German Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig, who had had a similar assimilated childhood. And he had me go to worship services for 2 months, every Saturday. And the services they had there were really extraordinary. There was no sermon. Different members of the congregation would lead a conversation. But because it was Harvard, the people who were leading the conversation was Michael Walzer, famous political scientist, who would be talking about the weekly Torah portion, and he'd give his interpretation, and then Ben Schwartz, who was the chair of Chinese studies, would tell him why he was wrong. And then Hilary Putnam, who was a professor of philosophy, would argue with them. And watching all of these people, Judy Case, who specializes in women's literature, all these great minds bringing passion to it, there was no way to worry about being stupid. And I fell in love. I fell in love with God in a really raw and personal way. I fell in love with Jewish tradition because it's so rooted in an open-ended culture of skepticism and rebellion and faith all at the same time. Admittedly, it could have been hormonal. The same semester that I fell in love with God, I met Ilana. So 36 years later, I'm still living with Ilana and the same God. So biology is destiny. But it's worked for me. You know, it's worked for me because, I'm just to say, when I started rabbinical school, women couldn't be ordained. And I was involved in that fight, and now I'm a rabbi who ordains women. And the next fight was LGBT. And I wrote a paper in 1985 calling for a way to do that within Jewish law. And I became instantly the most unpopular person in my rabbinical seminary. Like literally strangers would come up and yell at me in the cafeteria. And I have lived to have LGBT students of mine now serving as rabbis all across the country. And so partly what I want to say is you can make a difference if you're willing to take a stand and not worry about popularity. And for me, faith in God is part of what allows me to know that I'm loved, and therefore I can take a risk. Right? And so for me, God has been my steady companion. I have not lived a fairy tale life. I mean, I have, but I've carried plenty of burdens too. But God has made it possible for me. And I'm not saying it has to be the only way or the way that works for you, but for me, it helped integrate everything and pull it all together. Others?
Sure, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed just everything that you shared. What were some of the lessons that you learned at Branson that served you best in your life after Branson?
Okay, so we're going to be really personal. This should be off the record, but I'm not good at not saying things in public that I shouldn't. I'm a survivor. I went to town school for boys. There are 2 town school classmates. I believe that the intensity of our friendship was forged in the fires of Soroman, which are located on Jackson and Divisadero. Somebody needs to throw a ring at that place. It may be better, so I'm not saying anything about the school now, but at the time, it was Lord of the Rings. And it was soul-crushing. It was soul-crushing. And then I came here, and you had trees and girls. Those two things have an enormous civilizing effect. But here's what I want to tell you. I am, as you've already noticed, a fairly idiosyncratic person. And my classmates made room for me. And I felt like I had a community of people who welcomed me and allowed me to breathe and allowed me to be myself. So this whippy, beat-up town school kid, I got on the crew team. And crew taught me that I could, I just say, the great thing about crew is you don't have to have any athletic talent whatsoever. You just have to have the capacity to endure pain. I'm Jewish. So I could hold on and hurt. But crew, I work out almost every day to this day. I have a rowing machine in my home, and when I get on that machine, I'm 18 again. Right? And rowing out of the Corte Madera Creek, which was where we used to row, was great because we rowed past San Quentin, and the inmates would teach us things you could do with your biology that you wouldn't necessarily think of on your own. So part of what I learned here was that it's safe to be yourself. I learned that if you're a full person, you have a life of the mind and a life of the body as well. I learned that I could trust the people around me. I walk through life with my high school classmates around me, whether they know it or not, knowing that I can risk being myself because there's a circle of people who are going to accept me. They become family. I loved the inquiries and the rigor of the mind. I loved that no question was off limit, and people had really high standards for us. And so we were, and that's because they believed we could rise to that level. So AP Bio, AP History. I took some extraordinary classes with world-class teachers. And I know that because I went to Harvard, and the teachers I had in high school were every bit as good as the teachers I had in college. So I learned to love the mind. And then the other thing I learned was we used to have intense political conversations. Heated arguments sitting on the grass. And I learned that your learning isn't just for in a classroom. Your learning has to touch the world. And those all served me really well. So that's what I gained from this place. A lot of happy memories. I walked through the campus this morning, and I just remember so many things. We drove past, what was that church?
St. John's.
Was it St. John's? So we drove past St. John's. You guys don't do this anymore, but we had Vespers in St. John's. And every time I see that building, I think of Stacy. And I think of her singing To Serve With Love, and I can hear you singing it. And that's a gift that I'll take for the rest of my life. Right? So we just showed love and care. And that was, for me, what Branson ultimately was all about. High standards, both in what's expected of us and high standards for how we take care of each other.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.